everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Divorce and Separation Coach podcast. This week, we're talking about a very sticky topic in the context of divorce, selling the family house. Now, a lot of people get very attached to the family house, and it's one of the biggest assets in a lot of cases, and usually a pretty big area of contention. So to talk about what to think about, what mistakes to avoid, and how it all works in practice, I've invited Darren Small. Darren has over 25 years experience in the mortgage market, and he's acquired that experience both as a broker and on the lending side of the fence. He launched Eddge a few years ago, and he's been leveraging his decades of experience to help borrowers to secure property finance they need. Darren, welcome, and thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me.
So for those who are at that crossroads and trying to decide what to do with the family house, what are the options for the one who's hoping to maintain the house and to keep it with regards to getting full ownership of it?
Yeah, so I think in these kind of scenarios, it's useful to start that conversation early, okay? So there are no assumptions made in terms of what one can and what one can't do. I often find there's a big assumption that, hey, we've always been able to have a mortgage in the past and we've always been able to afford it. But that might not necessarily correlate with what a mortgage lender sees and how a mortgage lender views things.
Yeah.
Essentially, any mortgage lender is going to maybe take the emotion out of the conversation and simply look black and white in terms of how is this mortgage going to be paid for, and do they consider that that income that is going to be supporting this mortgage going to be sustainable for a significant period of time. Okay, so it will just be looked from a lending perspective as very black and white of what's the income going to be, how much is the mortgage going to cost, do we deem that affordable? If we do, yes. If we don't, no. And very little in between that, really.
And then, I mean, even if the lender accepts, or, if there's a chance of finding a lender who would, lend the money, there's still the question of whether that person can even afford it. It might be that at such a high interest rate, for example, or such a high monthly payment that it becomes prohibitive.
Yeah, hugely so. I think there's a big difference, and we often discuss it, between what a mortgage lender will lend, what they would give you, and whether that's actually going to fit into what you actually want to do. So I think there's probably two conversations there. How a mortgage lender would view things, and can you get the amount of money that you need to do this, versus what is actually going to cost you with all the other things and costs and commitments that you might have going on in the background. So looking at your own income and expenditure is going to be a key driver. And that's often why it's quite useful to have that conversation early doors. Maybe not into the nitty gritty and specifics of what a mortgage will be and what it will cost, but just ballpark. If I took on a mortgage debt of X, what roughly might that cost me per month? Because then one can do their own income and expenditure kind of analysis and look and say, okay, well, there's no way I can afford that. And that might then send you off down a different path of, well, maybe I don't keep the family home then. Maybe we do need to kind of sell and go our separate ways and buy a property each or whatever it might be. Okay, but looking at that income and expenditure early on in the conversation and getting an initial kind of ballpark, I think would be super useful. Yeah.
Yeah. And you're right. It's important to do it early on, because I hear people, I've had couples I worked with that were negotiating over the house, and the whole conversation was about when the property was going to be transferred. And actually, it turns out the person who was going to keep the house hadn't even checked that they could afford to keep the house, that they would even get a mortgage for it.
Yeah, exactly.
So, it's a moot point if you haven't had that exploration up front.
Yeah. And certainly most mortgage brokers will have that conversation early doors, because it can be quite a generic and quite easy kind of conversation. You know pretty early on in terms of roughly what someone could borrow. No two lender lends on the same kind of premise really, but you can have a fairly good range as to you're going to be able to borrow between X and Y, and that kind of interest rate is going to cost you circa this, which means you're going to have a kind of ballpark figure of this. So that kind of ballpark indication for the majority will kind of give them a clear understanding as to, yes, this works or no, it doesn't. So, most people would have that conversation early.
And so in terms of the actual logistics of it, so if you're buying out your spouse, does the previous mortgage just end? Are you paying termination fees, etc., and then you start a whole new mortgage, or does it get transferred? What's the technical side of things?
Yeah, so there's a few different options. I mean, I think for the vast majority of people, there's an existing mortgage in place. Okay.
Yeah.
And typically with most mortgages that are already in place, there's going to be kind of breakage clauses, for that. Okay.
Yeah.
If I speak about a mortgage lender for a second, whilst the mortgage lender is going to be sympathetic, to what's going on, again, unfortunately, they're going to go quite black and white where there is a mortgage contract, and if you break that mortgage contract, then you're going to pay us a penalty. End of.
Yeah.
Black and white area. No grace periods. No concessions. It's a penalty. If you don't want the mortgage anymore, pay us the penalty and move away. Okay. So in the first instance, if we're going to look at someone who's going to try to retain that property, well, let's retain that property and let's retain that same mortgage. Okay.
That's ideal. Yeah.
You can amend a mortgage contract, so taking one party off of that mortgage contract is fine.
Okay.
One just needs to be able to prove that the one staying on it can afford that new mortgage. Okay.
Yeah.
So in the first instance, for the vast majority of people, we would look at, right, who's your existing mortgage with? Can we keep that? Can we take it over in just your sole name? And if we need to borrow some more money at that same point in time to buy the other party out, we would go back to that same lender to have that same conversation.
Okay.
To avoid any kind of penalties and any kind of break clauses. Now, if that mortgage lender won't lend what you wish, or for whatever reason it can't be done, then yes, one would terminate that mortgage, pay the break clauses, and replace it with another lender's mortgage deal. Yeah.
And so I guess there's tax implications one way or the other, right? In terms of stamp duty, CGT?
Yes. Quite an apt point, really, because with stamp duty changing next month. So maybe historically, there wouldn't have maybe been such a stamp duty issue because, where the stamp duty thresholds lay, typically if you was buying someone out, it would be not so much rare, but you might have a small stamp duty liability or not too much. With the stamp duty levels dropping next month, to 125 at the bottom end, I would say the vast majority of people now, if they're buying someone out, there would be tax implications. Because most people look at it that even though we own the property jointly at the moment, well, surely there can't be any stamp duty because I'm not buying a new property. There would be a stamp duty liability, as you probably rightly know, that you are buying that other person out, so there is a stamp duty event. So it goes back to what we said a second ago. An early conversation to have would be with a solicitor to say, hey, this is what I'm thinking of doing. What would my taxes potentially be here? Yeah,
because there's also an impact in terms of your credit score. If you're breaking a mortgage agreement or ending it, is there an implication in terms of your ability to borrow in the future?
A lender's going to recheck you again. Yeah, a lender's going to look at what your credit score has been and look at how you conduct yourself. So even though you've got the mortgage, they're going to look at it through brand new eyes and deem whether they're happy to lend you or not. So it almost comes onto that piece of as and when you're going maybe through that breakup kind of stages, it's crucial that you maintain credit agreements, especially mortgage. Okay. A missed mortgage payment for a mortgage lender is pretty much the worst thing you can do, and in many cases with the gates, them wanting to lend again and probably close up other avenues for you as well. Okay, but from a credit score perspective, there might be a slight impact on you applying for a new mortgage, but truthfully, no, it's not nothing I would necessarily worry about it damaging a credit score. But I would likely say that having a good credit score at the point you come to do this is going to be vital. Yeah,
and so it sounds like what you're saying also is that maintaining the same mortgage is the ideal scenario where you can just remove one of the two. Then you're keeping everything as clean as it can be, really, rather than ending it, potentially having any kind of penalties and early repayment fees, etc. Right?
Yeah, I think that's the main thing, as you say. Wasting money on kind of paying early redemption charges and fees, etc. Would be a shame. So if we can retain that mortgage, avoid any kind of break clauses, that should be the first thing that that anyone looks at, really. Just kind of taking over that mortgage, and that can include increasing that mortgage to buy out a party that's coming off of it, really. That would be fine.
So if you do get to the conclusion that actually you can't afford to to buy back your ex and then you're going to have to leave the house. What are the options for people in terms of looking for other accommodation? Can they leverage any of their history with their previous mortgage lender to rent to buy a new place at that stage?
Yeah, as you say. So then it would pretty much just be starting from scratch. Right, we're gonna build the existing home. We're gonna have a lump sum's going to come out of it. That's going to be our equity. That's going to be our deposit, and then it would just be starting from fresh. So your mortgage history, in fact, your entire credit history, but especially your mortgage, will be the first thing that any mortgage provider looks at. So it goes back to what we just said a second ago of making sure that through that break, through that separation process, credit agreements are maintained. Mortgage lenders will not, again, they'll be very black and white. There might be some consideration given for, this is why the event occurred.
Yeah.
But if you've missed mortgage payments, if you've been late with mortgage payments, if you've been late with loan agreements or hire purchase or credit cards, it's certainly going to close doors for some of the bigger lenders. Okay.
Yeah.
Mainstream mortgage lenders are big beasts, very process driven. Okay. There's very little human element in it. Okay.
Yeah.
It's cliche, but it's computer says. Okay. And the computer does not look at, I was going through a separation and this is why we was late with a few payments. It will simply be the computer sees that you've missed some late payments. That does not fit our policy, but we will not lend. Now, there will be a huge group of lenders out there looking to kind of look at good quality business still and pick up those crumbs from the big lenders table.
Yeah.
But when you go to a smaller lender, be a building society or whomever, the rate's going to increase from that. So if we want to stay at the top table, everything needs to be maintained as it should be, really.
Yeah, because from the lender's perspective, it's about mitigating risk, right? Right. So that's what they're looking at, is all those different factors.
Yeah.
And so with that in mind, then is it harder to get a mortgage when you're on your own than when you're a couple?
I want to say no, but the answer unfortunately is yes. It depends how many kind of people are within the household. A joint couple, so two incomes going into a household and affording a mortgage, a lender looks at that more favourably. Okay, hey, if someone lost their job, you've still got another income coming in. A single person looking to get a mortgage will have a slightly harsher credit score, for a mortgage lender, and lenders maybe wouldn't lend as much to a single person as they would to a joint. Okay, and then when you've got maybe a single person with children as well, again that becomes harder. Okay, right? Yeah. We've got a single income trying to support 2 to 3 mouths maybe. Okay, that would make things harder. Yeah.
And what if that person doesn't work then? Do they take into account any spousal maintenance or any other payments that this person might be getting?
Yeah, again, that's quite easily done. Lenders are quite, aware that is the real world. Okay, so that's quite fine. As with any income, to be fair, be that self-employed income or employed income or maintenance income, as you say, it's going to be how much can we rely on that income. Okay, so your maintenance income is fine. Okay, yeah. Predominantly that would be supported by some kind of court order to say, hey, this is what I'm getting. So if one can prove that's what I'm getting, the same as one would prove this is my job and these are my pay slips. Yeah. Any form of income, then the vast majority of lenders will use said income accordingly. Okay. The slight difference you might have when it comes to kind of spousal maintenance income is how long is that income going to last for? Okay. Yeah. If it was maybe going to last until a child was maybe say 18, for example, they're going to want to know, how old is that child now? Okay, that child's 14. Okay, well, we only get that income for 4 years, and that would make a lender nervous. Okay.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So that's where it becomes more difficult. If you can maybe show that income over, say, a 10-year plus period, well, okay, fine. They're probably going to use that. They're probably going to be, quite agreeable with it. If that income's only going to be for another few years, you're going to find it difficult, I would suggest, to use that income in any kind of calculations.
Yeah. But they do. The good thing is that they do look at all money coming in, not just income from employment.
Correct, exactly. Any
Yeah.
form of income that you get, be that benefit income, be that maintenance income, employment, self-employment, whatever it might be, if you can evidence it, show a track record of it, in certain instances, or a confirmation that it will be a sustainable, ongoing income, then that will 100%, be used. And it doesn't always have to be even court ordered, I would say. Okay, I've
Yeah.
definitely done more people where there isn't a court order in place.
Okay.
Okay, and it maybe just means you just choose the lender that you want. Some lenders will be very strict on what they want. Some lenders will take a view.
Okay. Yeah, that's where it comes in handy to speak to a broker, because you know exactly who's more flexible, who's not.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
and so what I often see is, with one of the two retaining the property and buying out the other person then has to go off and buy their own place at that stage. And in the calculations around splitting assets, you do need to take into account the expense that comes from moving out of that house, buying a new property. Could you
Yeah.
give us some of the big items that people have to make sure that they take into account if they're planning on buying another place, so that they can budget it appropriately?
Yeah, sure. So, obviously the first one is going to be, the taxes involved. Okay, so stamp duty being the main one. Okay.
Yeah.
Whatever, you can quite easily these days just go on the internet and go onto like a stamp duty calculator, plug in your figures, okay, and find out what that number's going to be. Going to go up month, okay, but you can quite easily plug that in. I think one thing I would say, because I often get asked that, is you're not a first-time buyer, okay?
Yeah.
And I say that, which might sound daft, but quite a few people say, well, because I've not got a house anymore, am I a first-time buyer now? No, first-time buyer literally means what it says you are, buying for the first time. So these people wouldn't be first-time buyers. But stamp duty is going to be your big one, okay? And then you're going to have solicitors' costs involved to purchase new property. You might have some kind of valuation costs that you want to do, to check out your new property. Typically, mortgage lender fees and associated costs get wrapped up in the mortgage, so it's not cash you're necessarily going to have to find now. So I would say the two big and main ones would be stamp duty, solicitor's bill that you're going to need.
And potentially a surveyor as well.
Yeah, probably a surveyor. Well, then, quite a few mortgage lenders these days will pay that valuation for you. So your own independent one done, which might cost you a little bit as well. Okay, but again, all of those kind of costs, typically it goes back to what we were saying about having that conversation early. Can be kind of factored in early. As you say. We spoke about what would my mortgage cost. Well, what would it cost me to do so as well? Okay, stamp duty can be easily calculated. A solicitor's bill can be pretty much easily calculated as well, ballpark. Okay.
Yeah.
So you should know what it's going to cost going into it.
Yeah, and then just the smaller expenses like the actual movers, buying new furniture, that kind of stuff, which add up actually, but it's the little bits and bobs.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's always little fees and bits and pieces that come around. Yeah, exactly. I would always say to people, you want to put a few thousand on top of any kind of quotes you get, because there's always contingency. There's always little things that come out of the woodwork that you haven't budgeted for.
Now, the other thing that I see regularly is couples that are divorcing, and they have a mortgage together, and one of the two stops paying. So sometimes when the mortgage is in their name and they stop paying because they consider they're not living in the house. It might be, the wife is still in the house, the husband's moved out, and he considers he doesn't need to pay anymore. Are there any risks associated with doing that, or can you actually stop paying if you're no longer living in the house?
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised that, because that is something that we hear all the time as well. Or maybe people have just started doing it or are considering doing it, and it will be the first thing that I'd say you can't. Okay, it needs to be looked at through again, just those black and white eyes that a mortgage lender will look at this at. You are on a contract. Okay, as you rightly say, you might have moved out of there. Okay, but the mortgage being maintained is crucial. As a mortgage broker, speaking to a lender and speaking to them about maybe some late credit card payments or some maybe missed loan payments is a hurdle to overcome, and a tricky hurdle to overcome, but it can be overcome. Late, or worse still, missed mortgage payments is just a death knell often, okay? A mortgage lender does really not want to have much of a conversation past that once they found that out. I always say to people that A mortgage lender's looking, what is it you do when you have a mortgage? Okay, and goes back to what you were saying about looking at someone's kind of past credit history. What do you do when you had a mortgage? I didn't pay it. Okay, I missed a mortgage payment. Now you can explain that away of, hey, I was going through a divorce, or hey, I moved out, or hey, whatever it might be. Unfortunately, that's where the conversation for the vast majority will stop. Okay. In my world, you'll typically always find someone who will lend, but the differential in that kind of scenario between high street kind of rates and someone who will do it are horrendous. Okay, so
It's not worth it.
yeah, not at all. If you move out the property, hey, that's great, but there needs to be that kind of communication between the two people on that mortgage. Like, who's going to pay for this? Okay, the lender doesn't care who pays for it. It doesn't have to be 50-50 anymore, or whatever that split might have been. It just needs paying. Okay. So I would say that is vital. The most.
So that's interesting, that this point you're making around it just needs paying. So if one of the two stops paying their share, and the other one's the one in the house, so actually the one who's probably got a bit more to lose, if the house gets repossessed, then they effectively kind of have to pay the whole mortgage on their own because they don't want to lose the house, right?
Exactly. As you say, that needs to be kind of stepped up, and they need to pay that other share as well. Unfortunately, typically you will find in these kind of scenarios, if we relate for a second back to the existing mortgage provider, the last thing a mortgage lender wants to do is repossess a property, and they will go through as many hoops as they possibly can to avoid that scenario. Okay, so if it's going to be in that kind of situation whereby, like, I'm staying in the house, I want to retain the house, but the person who's left has stopped paying. I would suggest your very first phone call needs to be to that mortgage provider and just keeping them in the loop. Okay. There are dedicated departments within the vast majority of mortgage providers to have this conversation, okay? And they will work with you and they will understand, okay? They will be sympathetic, they will be empathetic, and they will try to work with you, okay? And if you keep them in that loop and let them know what's going on, then I would say 99 times out of 100, that's where all kind of problems cease. Because a mortgage lender can try to come to some arrangement with you. Hey, maybe we switch the mortgage from being a repayment, amortizing, debt, to maybe we just switch it to interest only. Yeah. So that will reduce your monthly repayments and maybe make it a bit easier for you. Your mortgage is still being paid in agreement with us, and then it's an issue. So if you're going to be in that scenario and you can't pay it yourself, then that first phone call to the lender to say, this is what I'm going through. Hey, what can we do? This is my plan. A lender will be really sympathetic to that. Yeah,
and I guess that makes sense because you're the one who's trying desperately to still continue to pay your mortgage, right? So they want to kind of keep you warm.
Exactly. Spot on. Yeah.
So, Darren, I like to finish my podcast with a kind of a wrap up, I guess, by asking my guests to share 3 tips. So in your context, what would be your 3 tips to somebody who is getting divorced and wants to retain the house?
Yeah, cool. So I would say tip number 1 in the first instance, have that conversation early and work out what you can afford, essentially. Okay. As I mentioned, any mortgage broker is going to be more than happy to have that conversation, and work with you, to see what you can do. Okay. Yeah. I'd probably say one of my second tips is maybe not even mortgage related. I would maybe say to, again, this is maybe just from experience, to maybe not get so hung up on keeping the existing property that you've got. Okay. I think we speak to an awful lot of people where the desperation, maybe, if that's the right word to use, to keep the family home, and I understand why, almost puts them in such a stretched financial position that I think maybe a wider context needs to be looked at here, really, in terms of maybe what's best for them. I get why you want to keep the family home, and often in my world, what you want to do, we can probably make work, but when you look at it not so much from a lender's perspective or what can be done, and maybe what you should do from an affordability perspective, okay, can be wild, okay, that you still need to live, okay, so don't spend your life just paying a mortgage. That's not what it's about. Okay, so maybe don't get so hung up on the property. Okay, and I think the third thing would be the point that we just raised of while you're going through that kind of process, maintain every single one of your credit commitments, not just mortgage, every single one of your credit commitments. So when you come to resort out your next deal, you're in that best financial position possible.
I love it. Thank you so much, Darren. They're all really useful tips and important for people to know about.
Yeah, thank you. Pleasure.
Have a good day.
And you. Take care.